With that said, though, let's not waste any more time. Let's get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day, bottom line, end of story, the first Thursday of the 2023 NCAA tournament is going to be defined by two major upsets. We'll get to Virginia in a minute, but if we're being perfectly honest, I don't know that Virginia was all that shocking. So instead, let's focus on Arizona, because Arizona comes in as about a 13, 14-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook, the 2 seed in the South region. If you listened to Wednesday's show, I thought it was good for them to get out of the West. They play in Sacramento in their opener. They play a Princeton team as a 15 seed that you thought they were going to roll over. And instead, they fall to Princeton in what was just the 11th ever number 2 seed to fall in the opening round of the NCAA tournament. Although ironically, this is now the 3rd year in a row that we have seen a 2 seed fall. 2 years ago, it was Ohio State losing to Oral Roberts in round 1. Last year, it was, of course, St. Peter's beating Kentucky. This year, it was Arizona falling to Princeton. And what's interesting about the Arizona thing is a couple things. One, I think you could argue it was both surprising and not surprising at all. Now, why it was surprising? It was surprising because Arizona had one of the most impressive resumes in college basketball this year. If you do what the committee does, which is look at everything from the opening day of the season until the last day of the season, you could argue Arizona had as impressive a resume as anybody. Beat UCLA twice in the conference, in the out-of-conference, won the Maui Invitational, beat San Diego State and Creighton there, beat Indiana on a neutral court, beat Tennessee. This was a really good team who at its best proved that they can play with and beat anybody. The problem is, and why this also probably shouldn't be that surprising, is that this team was also one of the most inconsistent teams all year. For as great as they were against Indiana and San Diego State and 2 out of 3 wins against UCLA, this was also a team that lost at home to Washington. This was a team that lost at Stanford. This was a team that got smacked at Oregon. And so it felt like, and it's interesting because when I look back on me taking Arizona to go so far in this tournament, I wasn't worried about a potential Elite Eight game with Arizona or with Alabama or a Final Four game. I was worried about the probably not so much the opening round. I was worried about a second round game against Missouri or Utah State. I was worried about a Sweet 16 game against a lower seeded team. I felt like if they could get to the Elite Eight, they matched up well with Alabama. Shame on me for believing that they could get there, though. And so as I look back on this game and I look back on this season, I think 2 things stand out to me. One, this probably was, in hindsight, and I blame myself because I believed him as much as anybody, this probably was a flawed team to begin with. But I'll also say this: year two, a 1 seed last year and a 2 seed this year. I think for the first time, the honeymoon's a little bit over for Tommy Lloyd. And that's not a criticism. It's not saying he's a bad coach. It's not saying he's the right person for the job. But I do think that he's almost walked on water since he's got to Tucson. And I do think, again, that honeymoon's over. Now, in terms of this Arizona team, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens this offseason and what this program looks like going forward. Because last year, obviously, look, Tommy Lloyd inherited a totally stacked deck. And to his credit, and we've talked about it many times, I thought Tommy Lloyd did as good of a job with last year's group as anybody possibly could have done. Ben Mathurin, first-round pick, was maybe the best player in college basketball at various points last year. Christian Coloco, Dalen Terry, both guys that were drafted early in last year's NBA draft, the top 3 top 35 picks overall. And then you had guys like Azuolas Tubelis. You had guys like Kirk Kriisa. You had guys like Oumar Ballo, who all played meaningful roles and had meaningful impact on last year's team. But this year, if you really go back and look, this kind of was a sort of flawed team all year. You look at this team, outside of Azuolas Tubelis, who was a phenomenal player, second-team AP All-American, this was a team that pretty much every other spot in every other game, you didn't know what you were going to get. Kirk Kriisa, who I enjoy him. A lot of people don't like him. But there is now a 2-year trend with Kirk Kriisa where he is great against inferior competition. And in big games, in big moments, I think that size and athleticism and skill overwhelms him. This was a guy that fouled out of both the last 2 UCLA games that Arizona played. This was a guy that I believe had 6 points against Princeton on Thursday in the opener. This was a guy that got ran off the court against Houston last year. And so it's not all on him. Courtney Ramey, who I hyped as a transfer, I will readily admit, was a disappointment this year. Pella Larson, a kind of a hybrid forward, didn't really evolve. And so part of this is it was just a flawed roster that, frankly, Tommy Lloyd probably overachieved with a little bit. But at the same time, I do think that, as I said a minute ago, I do think that the honeymoon is a little bit over for Tommy Lloyd. Again, does it make him a bad coach? Does it make him a bad person? By all accounts, every time I've been around him, I think he's just a good dude. But this was a guy that really up until Thursday had done no wrong as the Arizona coach. And now I don't really want to say there's questions about him right now today, but I do think there are questions about him going forward. Because as I said, and I've talked about this before, you can criticize Sean Miller for a lot, but Sean Miller left the cupboard full for him. And so again, to Tommy Lloyd's credit, he did about as much as anybody could have possibly done with last year's roster. Pac-12 regular season title, Pac-12 tournament title, number 1 seed, Sweet 16. But you did lose in the Sweet 16 last year. You did lose in round 1 this year. And I think, the Arizona fans are rightly starting to get restless. They're rightly starting to get restless because Arizona is one of these programs. Listen, they're not defined by what happens in the regular season. They're defined by getting to the tournament, being in a position to have success in the tournament, and winning in the tournament, right? It's like, think about, some of the other programs that we talk about regularly on this show. We're going into a Friday NCAA tournament where Dan Hurley kind of has to beat Rick Pitino. Why? Because this is now year 5 for Dan Hurley. This will be his 3rd straight NCAA tournament. UConn fans, at some point, you got to win in March. That is the expectation at UConn. John Calipari, he's won a lot of regular season games. He hasn't won enough in the tournament when it matters, and Arizona is one of those schools. You're not defined as the Arizona coach by beating Washington State and Oregon State and Cal and Washington and Stanford in the regular season. You're defined by what do you do in March, how far do you get, all that good stuff. Now, I will say, to be abundantly clear, any coach can have 2 bad NCAA tournament games. Listen, John Calipari, as I record right now, is coming off of a loss to we know what Calipari's resume is. Dan Hurley has not won an NCAA tournament game since he got to UConn. So this isn't to say that Tommy Lloyd can't do it, but now it is year 2 and we're going into year 3. And I think, again, that honeymoon is over. Now it's not so much about what you do in the regular season. It's not. Now the expectation has been set. We expect you to win in the regular season. It's not the joy of year 1. It's not the joy of year 2. It's you need to get back to March and you need to perform. I think what'll be interesting for Arizona is what this roster looks like next year, because just about everybody can come back. Now, Courtney Ramey can't come back. Umar Ballo is a senior, but I believe he has a year of eligibility left. And it'll be interesting to see what if Kirk Kriisa decides to come back for a 4th year, if Azuolas Tubelis decides to come back for a 4th year, because if they do, then it's going to be a lot of the same roster with a lot of the same expectations. Now, to Tommy Lloyd's credit, a couple interesting recruits coming in, specifically KJ Lewis, a top 25, 30 prospect. Kylan Boswell was a 5-star on campus this year, enrolled early. We didn't even know if he was going to play when he decided to enroll. And so he plays as a 17-year-old. Yes, it was discussed every Arizona game. And now I don't know if it's going to be his team because Kirk Kriisa could still be there. But again, Kylan Boswell, KJ Lewis, some transfer portal kids. This is going to be Tommy Lloyd's team. So again, not to say that other coaches haven't had 2 disappointing years back-to-back in the NCAA tournament. Not to say that Tommy Lloyd is the wrong guy. What I am saying is, though, you've set the standard in the regular season. We know you can win the games that you need to in the regular season. Now it's about getting back and having success in March. And I'll just say this, 2 quick last thoughts on Arizona before we get to Virginia. The first one, when a team tells you who they are during the regular season, believe them. I kept going back to that, watching this game, knowing how awful the pick was in my bracket. And I'm not trying to make this about my bracket, but Arizona all year was inconsistent. Arizona all year played up to great competition and down to bad competition. And as I'm watching the Princeton game, I said they told me all year who they were. Why didn't I listen to them? Why didn't I believe them? Instead, they lose in round 1. And 2, lastly, I'll say this, man. Listen, everybody kind of knows I've been a Sean Miller defender through the years for everything that he went through with the FBI and the media coverage and all that stuff. But one of the reasons why I defended Sean Miller, I think he's a very good coach that never gets credit. And it's wild because at Arizona, the criticism of Sean Miller was, well, how good of a coach can he be? He's never made a Final Four. And it's like, well, it's really hard to make Final Four. But he made 3 Elite Eights, including one that I was at. By the way, 2 of them he lost by 1 point apiece. I was at the 2014 Elite Eight against Wisconsin. The final 10 minutes of that game was a 1-possession game. Arizona loses in overtime. And so he made 3 Elite Eights during his time at Arizona, 5 Sweet 16s, and he left the cupboard completely full. Like, I think that, he had a national championship caliber team when he was let go in the spring of 2021. And so I just bring it up because, you know who looks good on Thursday night? Now we'll see how his Xavier team does on Friday against Kennesaw State. But you know who looks good on Thursday night is Sean Miller, because the guy that everybody was, oh, Tommy Lloyd this, and he's incredible that. Well, now back-to-back disappointments. Again, that's not even a criticism of Tommy Lloyd. It's just the fact that if the standard for a disappointing coach is can't get you to a Final Four, but he got you to 3 Elite Eights, that coach is probably pretty good. But just a disappointing night overall for Arizona. And in one of the most shocking stats, I don't think people would believe this if I told them, Arizona has not been to the Final Four since 2001. A lot of good teams since then, but they come up short, a little bit disappointing. I still believe in Tommy Lloyd, but he's going to have, next year is going to be his team, and he's going to have a lot of questions to answer.